Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're so happy to have you here online. My name's Cheryl Bronstein, and I am one of the staff members at Book Passage, an independent bookstore in the Bay Area that has been in business for over 40 years. And I want to thank all of our loyal customers and supporters for helping us to keep our doors open and the business flowing during this past year. It's been quite a challenge. Book Passage has two stores, our main store in Corte Madera and a store in the San Francisco Ferry Building. Both stores are open, so please come in, browse, and purchase your books from tonight's event for these titles and for other titles from our stores. And you can do that either online or in person over the phone. We're happy to help you, and we do offer curbside pickup. Also, for all the business owners out there, Book Passage has a thriving business-to-business operation. Books make the best gifts for your clients and staff, and we can help you purchase and ship large orders with excellent customer service and attention. If this interests you, please call our store and ask to talk to someone about corporate orders. So tonight we have a very interesting and enlightening program. And this is very personal because our featured author, Jennifer Risher, is a local Bay Area resident. She resides in San Francisco, and we love promoting local authors. I was just fascinated by her book, and I'm going to show you a picture of it right here. It's called We Need to Talk About Wealth. I was fascinated by her honesty about the lessons she learned, and I think you will be too. Not only is the topic of wealth essential to demystify, but there are also some very interesting tidbits about working the culture at Microsoft and Amazon, which I think you'll all find interesting as well. So a little bit of a background. In 1991, at the age of 25, Jennifer took a job at a small company at that time called Microsoft. Her timing was very good. At Microsoft, she met her future husband, David, and the stock options they were granted were worth eventually hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, years later, after they were married, David, with his love of books, took a big risk. He quit his very high-paying job at Microsoft and took a gamble at the time on an unknown startup book-based business in Seattle called Amazon. In their early 30s, when Amazon went public, David and Jennifer's hundreds of thousands of dollars turned into tens of millions of dollars. Jennifer grew up middle class. She had middle class values and was pretty wary of the rich. She was surprised and I would say unprepared for her extreme wealth. She has spent years writing about the hidden impact of wealth that it has on family, on identity, and the sense of place in the world. She hopes her new book, We Need to Talk About Wealth, will become a catalyst for a conversation. And no matter how much is in your bank account, money is often an uncomfortable topic to discuss. Now today, Jennifer and David are the founders and supporters of numerous nonprofit organizations, and they continue to give back to the community. We're also joined by Cameron Huddleston. She's the author of this wonderful book, Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk. How to have essential conversations with your parents about their finances. She's also an award-winning journalist with nearly 20 years of experience writing about personal finance. Her work has appeared in Forbes, Chicago Tribune, Yahoo, and many other online and print publications. She has also appeared on CNBC, MSNBC, Fox and Friends, has been featured in the New York Times, US News and World Report, Huffington Post, and Market Watch, and more. So we are very fortunate to have these two powerhouse women with their excellent books to enlighten us, and I think sure we will have a very interesting discussion about wealth tonight. So at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Jennifer and to Cameron.
Well, good evening. And
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much, Cheryl.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Book Passage. Thank you, Jen, for inviting me to have this opportunity to interview you about your book because I absolutely loved it. I have written about money for 20 years as a financial journalist, as Cheryl mentioned, and I just so enjoyed reading a personal story about how wealth impacted someone, that someone being you. And you were so honest. And I know that it's a taboo topic because, as I said, I've been writing about it for many, many years, and people are often reluctant to talk about money. So I want to get into this. I want to talk to you about your book. And I want to start by asking you, why did you write We Need to Talk, and who is your audience?
Thank you, Cameron. Yes, I wrote for many years, and let me back up again. I think Cheryl shared a lot of my story, but I just want to say that I got really lucky. 30 years ago when I joined Microsoft, I met my husband, David, and yeah, we had stock options that were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then 6 years after we met, when we were married and we were expecting our first child at the time, David joined this small unknown startup that was selling books on the internet. And he was the 37th employee. The company went public, Amazon.com, and we were in our early 30s, and we really had more money than we could wrap our heads around. And I do want to say up front that money makes life easier. I'm very fortunate. But wealth surprised me. Having a lot of money doesn't look or feel like what Hollywood sells us. Wealth can be isolating. And I felt the impact as a parent, as a sister, and as a friend. And as a daughter, it was painful to feel my parents disapproved of what I had. 8 out of 10 people with wealth grew up middle class or poor, and we're not talking to each other about the emotional challenges. Now, it might be hard to think of wealth as a challenge that needs to be overcome. I'm very, very lucky, and especially now with so much need in this country. I mean, COVID has spotlighted racial and economic inequality. I should pay more taxes. Minimum wage needs to be higher. We need a stronger social safety net. There are so many policy changes that are needed, but I think change is needed at a personal level too. And my goal is to help us move money out of the taboo category and out of the shame category and get us talking to each other. Because normally, if I have a challenge, I turn to my friends. If I want to figure out should our 16-year-old have a curfew, I talk to everyone I know. It's how I do my research. I get different ideas, I hear different advice and about different people's experiences. I mean, and just talking is helpful because it lets me know that my challenge is normal, that it's valid, and that it's shared. But the same doesn't happen with money. And I couldn't talk to friends about having a lot of it. So I thought, well, I'll turn to books, but there really are no books. So I wrote the book that I needed and wanted to read. And I wrote my book for the millions of Americans like me who have more money than they had growing up, or they have more money than others in their extended families, or more money than many of their friends. I'm telling my story as a way for other people to understand their own. And my goal is not to show people how to do rich right. I don't have the answer for that. I'm simply offering up a story that hasn't been told, one that explores things like how challenging it can be to navigate a vacation with another family that doesn't share your resources, or how upsetting it can be to feel a friend's jealousy and not be able to share what's really going on in your life. I want to demystify wealth. I want to validate these experiences, and I want to get us talking. Because the more I talk about money, the more I realize that it's not money, it's not the numbers that we don't talk about. It's the emotions behind the money that we avoid. And these emotions are universal. It doesn't matter how much is in your bank account. You're probably uncomfortable and afraid to talk about money. We're afraid. We're afraid of hurting other people's feelings. We're afraid that we won't measure up. We're afraid of rejection. We're afraid we won't sound knowledgeable. We all have some degree of shame around money, and we all have a money story. And our money story starts in childhood. This is where we learn our habits and our attitudes towards money. And actually, I'll read a little bit to you from my book that describes my parents' background. And this is at the beginning of the book from my childhood. While I was growing up, there had always been a rainy day lurking in the living room. My mother stuck closely to her grocery list, used the same tea bag for a second and third cup of tea, and only drove when necessary because gas was expensive. When my father sat at his desk, opening envelopes and paying bills in clouds of cigarette smoke, I tiptoed past. Finances made him grumpy. The oldest of five, my father had grown up in Middletown, New York, where he rushed to the dinner table to gulp down his food before someone else could claim it. His father had dropped out of school in 8th grade to work, and his mother was a second grade teacher. The family didn't have much money. Although my grandfather worked his way up in a bank, eventually becoming branch president, my father continued to worry about getting enough to eat. Meanwhile, my mother, an only child, grew up upper middle class in Flint, Michigan. Her father was a prominent lawyer, her mother a volunteer on the local hospital board, and both were keenly aware of proper etiquette. They participated in theater group and bridge club and were careful to keep up appearances. When she was scrubbing the floor in a housecoat and curlers and a stranger rang the doorbell, my grandmother put on an accent and pretended to be the help. "The lady of the house isn't home," she said.
Wow, that's great. Jen, you said that wealth surprised you. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we all have this idea of what wealth is. How many of you out there have imagined, oh, what would I do if I had $1 million? And I remember that conversation with my friend in high school. We thought, what are we going to do? What would we do if we had $1 million? And of course, at the time, I thought, well, I'd have a cute boyfriend and a fancy car. But really, what I thought was all that money would change everything, that my life would be perfect. And I think we often set ourselves up this way, thinking, if only, then my life would be perfect. And we do it a lot around money. If only I could get that big promotion. We do it around other things too, like if only I could lose 20 pounds, or if only I met the right person, then my life would be perfect. A friend of mine told me how she used to lie in bed at night, unable to sleep, thinking, if only I could make $100,000. And then she started laughing because she was making a lot more than that, but she was still lying in bed at night, unable to sleep. I had an if only happen, and I'm still me. I still have insecurities. My feelings get hurt. I make mistakes, and I'm not in a fantasy land. Our view of wealth is very narrow and incomplete. We see the glitz and glamour, and we know about the corruption and the greed. We know the Kardashians and the Real Housewives. We know about Jeffrey Epstein and the parents who illegally tried to get their unqualified students into top schools. We see the highly visible wealth and the stereotypes. But remember, 8 out of 10 people with wealth grew up middle class or poor. And we're a lot more ordinary and more diverse than what we see in the movies and on TV. And we're not talking to each other. Why aren't we talking to each other about the distance that wealth can create in families and between friends? And that wealth doesn't come with a handbook that tells you how to hire a good financial planner, or how to come up with a philanthropic strategy, or how to raise kids who aren't spoiled. We should be talking to each other. But money is a taboo subject, and it doesn't have to be. And also, no one wants to be judged. It's easier to stay quiet, but I can't stay quiet. I think it's incredibly important to shine a light on the reality of wealth and start conversations that aren't being had, especially now when there's so much suffering in our country, people going without housing, without healthcare, without food. I mean, there's an education crisis. It may sound that talking about wealth is beside the point, but I think it's essential. Our silence has a lot of power. Our silence keeps us from examining our relationship with money. It allows us to stay in our bubble, unaware of our own privilege. Silence keeps the status quo in place. I want to shake that up.
Well, I love that you are, and I love that you are sharing your story in your book, and you've shared it so eloquently. I'd love to hear, though, a little bit more about your writing process. What did that look like?
Thanks for that question. I mean, it was a long process. It took me 14 years to write this book. And initially, it really was trying to figure out this phenomenon that, this thing that had happened to me. And, writing helped me kind of gain clarity. And I think the best way to describe kind of the journey of those 14 years is to share with you the different titles that my book has been. So when I first started out writing, I was writing The Embarrassment of Riches. And it was the embarrassment of riches for many, many years. And during this time, I remember I went to a writer's workshop, and it was in Squaw Valley. It was over a weekend, and I had basically been teaching myself to write. So I was really excited to actually meet other writers and talk about writing. And I remember there was these opening remarks, and I looked around, and there were 200 or 300 other people in the room, and the woman was saying, everyone around you shares a love for the written word, shares a love for the story. This is going to be a weekend of learning from each other and community. And I was thrilled. I mean, I was trying to figure out, how do I piece together my experiences in a way that's compelling? How do I talk about money in a way that's not off-putting or offensive? So I was really excited to talk about writing, until I realized that I had to introduce myself. I didn't know anyone in the room. And then the first question people would ask me, and the first thing I'd have to say, is what I was writing about. And it's hard to introduce yourself and then say, I'm writing about having a lot of money. I spent time in my room crying. It was difficult. And I remember one woman I introduced myself to. I said, I'm Jennifer, and I'm writing about the experience of having of wealth. And she looked at me and she said, "You don't look rich." I didn't take it as a compliment. I was embarrassed. And so it was an embarrassment of riches for many, many years. And then it evolved to the tiniest violin. And then it's not about the money. And then Confessions of a Rich Woman. And then The Last Taboo. And it was the last taboo for quite a while. And then it became What We Don't Talk About When We Don't Talk About Money. And then it landed on We Need to Talk, a memoir about wealth.
Well, I'm glad that Confessions of a Rich Woman didn't stick. I'm not sure that would have been my top choice among all of those other titles that you went through in the process. And I do love that you landed on We Need to Talk, because that's so important, getting this out into the open and helping people have these conversations. But I want to ask you, maybe this is a tough question, maybe it's not. Do you think, now that you and your husband have acquired a lot of wealth, have you found that money brings happiness?
You know, People always ask this question, or they think, does money bring happiness? And I used to tell myself, well, money doesn't make you happy, secretly thinking that it just might. I mean, how could it not? And yes, if you are struggling to get by, every dollar does bring more happiness. But once your needs have been met and comfort achieved, you can take a vacation. Um, your more money doesn't mean more happiness. In fact, a very well-known study out of Princeton University found that at $75,000 a year, your happiness plateaus. I mean, $75,000, that was, the research was in 2010. So maybe it's a little bit more, but the basic concept I think holds that, you could be making twice that. You can be making 10 times that amount, and you're not going to be twice as happy. You're not going to be any happier. So there's a plateau where money really doesn't bring more happiness. And that's been my experience. And there's a lot of research out there about happiness and what does make you happy. I mean, when you think about how you spend your money can make you more or less happy. Spending on experiences, spending on other people tend to make you happier. I think finding a sense of purpose and meaning in your life makes you happier. Most research points to our relationships. It's the quality of our relationships with each other that really bring us happiness. We all want to be seen and connected.
I agree totally. Now, in your book, you wrote that you had some awkward conversations at times about money. And I was curious if you'd be willing to share some of the conversations, awkward or not, that you did have about money.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, so for many, many years, I tried to keep our money hidden and I didn't have conversations. And looking back, I wish I had had the courage to talk. And so, yes, I'd love to share some experiences of conversations I've had myself. But then also, I just want to invite everybody on this call to get uncomfortable, because having conversations about money is not something we know how to do. We don't have that muscle built up. So we're not going to get it right. We're going to fumble around, but it's so important to try, because on the other side of that conversation is really a chance to truly connect and to learn. I'll start with a friend of mine who's middle class. So she and her husband drove the same car for many, many years. And she said, when that thing finally broke down, I bought my dream car. I bought an Audi Q5. And she'd always wanted that car, and she was thrilled. She loved the car. But then she was planning a visit to her sister, and she started to imagine driving up in the car. And in her mind, she heard her sister saying, "Ooh, aren't we fancy?" And then in her mind, she started to justify the car. It was used, it wasn't that expensive. And I think we often do this. We tell ourselves stories and we make assumptions. What if she'd actually talked to her sister? When we don't talk about something, it tends to loom large and take on a life of its own. And I think this gives money so much power. Um, I'll share a story of me and my brother. So my brother, I have a brother who's 2 years younger. And when he graduated from college, he went into the Peace Corps, and then he got a master's in Spanish and became a high school Spanish teacher. And he wanted to buy a house. This is many, many years ago. And he was looking for a house, and David and I offered him $20,000 towards his down payment. And he refused our gift. He said he wanted to live within his own means. And at the time, that his refusal really hurt my feelings. I felt as though he were looking down at us and looking down at our money, and my feelings were hurt, but I didn't say anything. And then, a few years later, when he was getting married, Dave and I sent him a check as a wedding gift, and he thanked us. And a few years after that, when his first child was born, we again sent money, and he and his wife thanked us. And we started sending money every year. And over the course of many years, he stopped thanking us for our gifts. I'd write a check in December and hear silence. It was like that money was just disappearing into a void. And I began to feel resentful, and I felt taken for granted, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I told myself stories and made assumptions. I thought, well, he's embarrassed. Or I really thought he thinks we have so much money, it just doesn't mean anything to us. So I didn't say anything, and I'm not too proud to admit this, but just a few years ago, I just didn't send a check. And after that, we were communicating in email. And at the end of one of his notes, he sent a note saying, I'm wondering if a certain year-end check is just late in the mail. Is it? And as soon as I read that, I was shocked and angry. And of course, I knew we had to talk. Here I was writing a book, hoping to get people talking about money, but it's not easy. It's very uncomfortable. And I had to really sit down and think about what I wanted to say, what I really felt, what I hoped to achieve. And, when we got on the phone, I told him, my feelings are hurt that you haven't been thanking us for our gifts. And he apologized right away. He said he hadn't realized, and that he actually thought that it was more comfortable for me if he didn't make a big deal of the money, which completely made sense given how we grew up. And then we started talking. And then, when we were talking as two people who love and trust each other, when we were connected, we could put money in its place, not as something bigger than the two of us, but as a tool. And at that point, we could talk about money. He said, I don't need this money, but I really appreciate it. And I'd never asked. I said, I don't care what you're doing with it, but what are you doing with it? I want to know. I want to be part of your life. Another conversation was with a very good friend who, a year after the fact, she said, Jen, I almost didn't invite your family to join ours to see that Cirque du Soleil show. And I remember going to that show with them. And I said, why? What do you mean? And she said, I agonized for weeks. I was worried that, you'd want to sit in front row seats, and our family just can't afford that. And I felt terrible. I hated to think of her worrying about the finances. Our friendship meant more to me than front row seats. Didn't she know that? But I'm so glad she said something. In fact, the fact that she trusted me enough to talk about money made me feel closer to her. And that conversation also made me more aware of how out of touch I could be, which is another reason that I think conversations are just so important.
I do have one more question that I want to ask you, but we actually got a couple questions from the audience, and I don't want to neglect them. So I'm going to ask them quickly. And they're similar. So I think you could probably answer both of these questions in the same response. Someone was asking about, person said they would love to hear some advice on how to handle her daughter's discomfort with their family's wealth. It's caused a lot of strife in the family, and she's not sure, or he is not sure how to handle it. And then someone else said that she was looking for advice on how a parent can help help their children lead balanced lives. So, how do you deal with a child who is feeling uncomfortable with your family's wealth, and how do you help your children lead balanced lives if you are wealthy?
Those are very big questions, and it would take a lot to unpack all of that. I think, kids at different ages and at different stages need different messages. And, I'm thinking about the child who is uncomfortable with her wealth. I mean, how old is that child? And I think it's, often it's identifying what feelings are coming up. I mean, there's so much emotion around money, and kind of really getting clear about your feelings. But that question is one I'm not going to answer right away. I'm going to go to the other question, just because I think it's so common for people to worry about spoiling your kids. How do you ensure your kids are grounded, they're not entitled around money? And it could be at any level. No one wants to raise kids who are spoiled. And I think in the end, it's not about a conversation in this case with your kids, no matter how old they are. I mean, I think it's living your own values, and it's living those values day to day, week to week. It's your kids are watching you, and it's not about what you say only. It's about what you do and how you move through the world. And just thinking about a situation that's probably common, going to the grocery store. What do you do when you're driving up and someone steals your parking spot? I mean, are you gracious? Do you get angry? Do you feel entitled? Like, your kids are watching your reaction to that kind of thing. And then going into the grocery store, how do you select products? It's actually a great teaching moment when you can take 2 cans of tomato sauce off the shelf and compare prices and value and how they're packaged and what that means. And, there's that teachable moment there of how you're making your selections and what matters to you. Are you buying organic, and can everyone buy organic? And how do what do you value when you make your selections? And then when you get to the meat counter, how do you interact with the person behind the counter? Are you gracious? Are you respectful? When you're checking out, the same thing. How do you interact with other people? Because your kids are watching you and they're listening to you around the dinner table. When you're, what are you proud of about your day? What do you talk about? What are your goals? It's a lot about attitude and gratitude, I think. And this is a big question, but I think we have such a fear. There's such the spoiled rich kid looms so large in our heads. And if I were talking to myself, 20 years ago, I would have told myself, don't be so worried. There's a lot to handle with wealth as kids get older, but when they're growing up, I think if you live your values and are true to the way you want to be in the world, your kids are gonna take that on.
Well, your point about living your values and sharing those values with your children is a great segue to my last question, which is I'd love to hear about your philanthropy and your giving.
Yeah. I talked about, we all have a money story that starts in childhood. And I think part of that money story, we learn about giving or we don't learn about giving. And for me, I took canned peaches to food drives with my mom, and we took clothes to the Goodwill, but I never really saw my parents giving financial donations. It wasn't part of my upbringing. I mean, my dad sort of felt like charity was for chumps. And so that was sort of, when we saw someone on the street who was asking for money, the attitude was a little bit like, oh, they're trying to take advantage of us. So that was kind of the childhood I was kind of coming out of. It really wasn't until I got to Microsoft and I was surrounded by peers who were making charitable donations. And I gave a percentage of my paycheck to United Way. And the next step was really starting to give back to places that had given to me. I gave $1,000 to Planned Parenthood. And then David and I gave to NPR and we gave to my mother's group. And then the next sort of step there was, I guess I'm saying in large part that, we're all on a journey. We're all on a journey when it comes to our giving, and it changes and grows and evolves. And that's certainly kind of been my experience. And one of the big markers was when our daughters entered independent schools, and then I was like in this foreign world with a foreign language. All of a sudden I was learning about development and fundraising and stewardship and governance and asks and capital campaigns and endowments and all these things I knew nothing about. And it was this same time when our financial advisor suggested that we put money into a donor advised fund. And a donor advised fund is sort of a charitable vehicle where you put money in. You get your tax break up front, and then it's kind of an organizing mechanism too. You can kind of give over time. It's like a charitable checking account. So your money goes in and then you can give over time. And at that time, where I was in my kind of evolution in philanthropy was sort of, I realized that letting go of the money wasn't really the hardest part. For me at that time, it was figuring out, where do I want those funds to go? And I thought I had to have a philanthropic strategy. I had to do all the research. I had to get it absolutely perfectly, and I done perfectly. And I was so fearful of getting it wrong that I felt stuck. And I think a lot of people come to this place. And my encouragement is, just look within yourself, figure out what you care about, and just start. This is another muscle that we need to build, and you need to just get started. And let me jump way ahead. That was probably 20 years ago, but I want to share something I'm very excited about that my husband and I started in response to COVID. So this time last year, we were sheltering in place, and my husband runs a nonprofit himself. So he was feeling, funding was drying up. He couldn't hold his, party that he was planning to hold to do fundraising. And our hearts were just going out to nonprofits who were working harder than ever. There's more need out there than ever. And, they're unable to hold their luncheons, they can't fundraise. And, I was sort of doubling down on places that I was already giving, but we wanted to do more, and we wanted to just give to nonprofits. And we wanted our money to go further. So we were very aware, and here's where the donor advised fund comes back in. We're very aware that, donor advised funds are good in some respects, but there's so much money sitting in donor advised funds right now, stuck. It's over $140 billion sitting in donor advised funds. So we thought we want to kind of help move that money through to the nonprofits now when it's needed more than ever. So we put up $1 million, and we said anyone with a donor advised fund who commits to spending out half the money in their DAF, we will match wherever you want to give. So people could give wherever they wanted, as long as it didn't promote violence or gun violence or hate speech or hate crimes. Give wherever you want. As long as you commit to halving your DAF, we will match funds. So our $1 million last year, when we started in May, we put up $1 million. We said half your DAF, and that million moved $8.6 million out to nonprofits in just 5 months. It also created an incredible sense of community with donors telling us how, this was inspirational. It was the nudge they needed to get money moving. They told us they were sitting around the dinner table with their adult kids, talking about where they wanted to give, having money conversations that they otherwise wouldn't be having. So it's very fulfilling. And we also worked a lot with nonprofits and helped build the relationship between nonprofits and donors, which is another key piece of successful philanthropy. And we also started to hear people say, well, when you do this next year, and it was so powerful and so successful that we are now running Half My DAF 2021. So anyone out there who has a donor advised fund, we encourage you to join us. Help your giving go further with Half My DAF. We will be matching grants mid-May, and then again at the end of September. And last year we had people give to 750 different nonprofits, and we were able to match 350 grants. This year we have $3 million we want to give away as inspiration to get people giving to nonprofits now. So I just want to lead you to halfmydaf.com. You can see it, our website up there, and our goal really is to inspire giving. So I appreciate that question, Cameron. I want to now turn it around to you, because you've also written an incredible book, Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk: How to Have Essential Conversations with Parents About Their Finances. And I'm going to ask you the same question you asked me. Why did you write the book, and who's your audience?
I wrote Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk because I don't want people to make the same mistake that I made. When I was 35 years old and I had 2 young children at the time, and my mom was 65, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She was living alone because she and my father had gotten divorced several years before then, and actually my father had passed away. And so I knew that I was going to have to be the one to help her, to help care for her, and to help manage her finances. But I had not had any detailed conversations with my mom about her finances. I had a general idea of where she stood financially. I knew that she owned her home outright. I knew that she had just retired from a job. I knew that she was getting Social Security income. I knew that she was doing okay financially. I knew that she wasn't a big spender. I also knew that she had some money that she had inherited from her parents, but I didn't know any details. And suddenly I was in a position where I had to scramble. I had to scramble to get her to meet with an attorney to update all of her legal documents, to name both me and her sister power of attorney so we can make financial decisions for her once she was no longer able to name as her healthcare proxy so that we can make healthcare decisions for her, to update her will. And then I had to play detective to figure out the details of her finances as she was forgetting them. And I realize I realized in writing my book, I realized after I was thrown into that situation that that was a mistake. So many people think they don't need to have these conversations with their parents. So many people don't even realize they need to have these conversations with their parents, but they think they don't need to have them until there's an emergency, until there's a reason to have them, until there's a health issue, until there's a financial issue. And at that point, it can be too late. Those legal documents might not be in place. You might not have the legal right to step in and help your parents. You're going to have to play detective like I did. And even if you never have to help your parents with their finances while they're living, everyone dies. And if your parents die without a will or a trust, then you, the child, are going to be the one who has to deal with what's left behind. And you're not going to have any directions for dealing with it. And family members are going to start fighting, possibly. And you could all end up in court arguing over who gets what. And this is not a situation that any family should have to go through. And so I wrote my book to help people avoid ending up in these situations, to help them realize they need to have these conversations sooner rather than later. They need to be talking to their parents. I know it's awkward, but I can promise you that the consequences of not having these conversations are a lot worse than that awkwardness that you might face when you start to have these conversations. And this book is not just geared to families with a lot of wealth. In fact, lower income families are going to benefit even more from having these conversations because the children are going to be much more likely to be playing a role in their parents' financial lives as they age.
Yeah, thank you for that. It like you said, it's better to have that awkward conversation. And how do you have that? I think just saying, "This is awkward, mom. I really want to have this conversation with you," setting that groundwork, and it's not comfortable. And I think I say that for everyone. Just acknowledging the discomfort, I think, kind of can help break the ice. Cameron, in your book, you have a survey that found that most adults haven't had detailed conversations with their parents about their finances, and that one of the top reasons is that people are afraid. And I 100% understand this. Why do you think that's the case?
I think this is the case for several reasons. I think we tend to exaggerate in our minds what's going to happen when we try to initiate this conversation. We think, oh my gosh, mom and dad are going to lose it if I ask them about their finances. There's no way they're going to talk to me about this. They're going to be so angry. They're never going to want to talk to me again, or they're going to think I'm being greedy. They're going to think I'm being nosy. They're going to tell me to butt out. You're going to go through all these scenarios in your head telling you how this is going to play out, and it's going to play out badly. But I want people to step back and think, is this really going to happen? What are the chances that mom and dad are going to get so angry they're never going to talk to you again? What are the chances they're going to think that you're being nosy or greedy? Well, they might if you approach it from the wrong way. If you go to them and say, hey, mom and dad, I want to know if I'm in your will, and I want to know how much money you're giving me. I mean, yes, that conversation is not going to go well. But if you approach these conversations out of love and respect, there's a very good chance that your parents are not going to get angry with you. They might balk initially. It might take a little time for them to come around and warm up to the idea of talking to you about their finances. But if you continue to let them know how important these conversations are, I really do think that those fears that you have about having these conversations with your parents will most likely not materialize. Most likely, they will be happy that you are showing an interest in their well being, that you're looking out for them, and you want to be prepared to help them if they ever need help. Now, granted, there are going to be some parents who are not going to want to have this conversation, and it will be difficult for some people. But as I said, a lot of people I do think will find that this conversation is not going to be nearly as difficult as they think it might be.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, that's what I kind of believe too, that we often tell ourselves stories, and we kind of make up all these stories about how our parents might react, but we don't really know. We're just telling ourselves stories. So it's important to kind of, yeah, step forward and have conversations. When do you think it's important? I mean, when should kids approach their parents about this? Is there a timing that you recommend?
I get asked this question all the time, and people often want to put an age on it. Well, should it be when your parents are 65, when they're 70, when they're 75? And I would say that's too late. You want to have these conversations ideally when your parents are relatively young, ideally before they've retired and while they are in good health, because this will allow you to lay the groundwork for any of those emergencies that might pop up. If you wait for the emergency to happen, as I said earlier, it can be too late. So, while mom and dad are still working and they're still healthy, this is a great time, especially if you're young and you're just starting out yourself, to go to your parents and you can even say, "Hey, mom and dad, I'm looking for some advice about my finances," because parents love offering advice, right? And so it's not an awkward way of bringing up the topic. You're asking your parents for advice. "Hey, I just got married. Do you think I need a will now? Do you think I need life insurance?" Their response is going to give you an indication about what sort of planning they've done. And that's the goal here. You don't need to necessarily know how many dollars they have in the bank account, but you want to know where they bank. You want to know, do they have those essential estate planning documents? Have they named a power of attorney? Do they have a healthcare proxy? Do do you know how they pay their bills if they were to end up in the hospital? And you had to start taking that over for them to make sure the water bill was still getting paid, the mortgage was still getting paid, or the rent was getting paid while they're, coping with an emergency. These conversations are going to help you be prepared for when those emergencies do happen or for those occasions when you might have to step in and potentially provide caregiving support or financial support. You don't want to wait till you're in the thick of it because emotions will be running high. People aren't going to be thinking rationally. And the last thing you and your parents are going to want to discuss in that moment is finances.
Thank you. I have one more question I'd like to ask you. Like, what happens when your parents refuse to talk about it? Does that happen? What would you recommend there?
It happens. It certainly happens. I interviewed several people for my book who struggled to talk to their parents. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to start early because it can take time. It can take years in some cases to get your parents to warm up to the idea of sharing any information with you. And so, maybe it just has to start on a very general level, not asking about their finances, but hey, mom and dad, how do you envision retirement? What are you looking forward to? What do you think your retirement is going to be like? Just getting to think ahead to the future, laying that groundwork for talking about, bigger issues. Okay. So retirement to you looks like spending a lot of time on the golf course, or maybe moving to Florida, or maybe living closer to me and your grandkids. How is that going to happen? How are you paying for retirement? Are you relying on Social Security? Do you have retirement savings? You keep the conversation going. But if they are refusing to talk, there are a few things that you can do. If they don't want to tell you about their finances, ask them to put it in writing. Ask them to make a list of their financial accounts, their usernames and passwords, their insurance policies, where the estate planning documents are, where the lockbox key is, where that social security card is, or what their social security number is. Make that list. Tell them to put it someplace safe, but to tell you how to access it and under what circumstances you would be allowed to access it. This allows your parents to maintain control over that information, but it's there and it's waiting for you for a time when you might need it. That's not ideal, but It's a way to get through to parents who are reluctant to talk. You could ask a third party to help. Maybe your parents work with a financial professional, and you can reach out to that financial advisor and say, hey, I'd love it if you could encourage mom and dad to share at least some information about their finances and their financial planning with me. You could ask a family friend. You could ask a trusted family member, perhaps someone who's had these conversations with their children, to share with your parents the benefits of having these conversations and how it helps everyone get on the same page. And if your parents are refusing to talk and they're not about to come around, then you need to prepare yourself and think about, okay, what level of support am I willing to provide my parents if down the road they come to me asking for support? Am I going to tell them, look, mom and dad, I tried to talk with you about this years ago. I wanted to plan, but I'm not in a point now where I can help you. Or do you start setting aside money and a special emergency fund to help care for your parents? Talk to your siblings, get on board with them, and figure out what roles you're willing to play, and what help you're willing to give your parents. Prepare yourself financially for the possibility, prepare yourself emotionally for the possibility that you might have to help your parents out if they're not willing to talk to you now and share details of their finances, but you suspect that maybe down the road they are going to need that help from you. So they're not willing to talk. You've got to prepare yourself for what your response will be or how you're going to help or not help.
Thank you. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks so much. And I'm actually now like peeking at the chat, and I want to try and address some of these questions. And I didn't really address the one about the daughter who's uncomfortable. I'd be happy to talk to you. So you can reach me through my website at jenniferrisher.com. Send me a note and we can chat. I have two daughters. They're 21 and 23. So be happy to share kind of my experience. Someone else is asking about, they want to give my book to friends and they're worried that it's going to insult them. I mean, first of all, read my book for yourself and see what you think. I mean, I'm really just sharing my story. And actually at the end of every chapter, I've included some questions. So it's kind of a nice book to read with someone. Maybe you give it to them and read it together. And then if you want to have, it'll prompt conversation. I mean, this is difficult. And the questions at the end of each chapter are really to get you thinking for yourself. It's contemplation and conversation, and to use those questions with a friend, or read the book with a partner, or read the book with a parent. It really is to try and kind of unlock us and get us talking to each other. Someone's asking, do I think that I'd have a less egalitarian outlook on life if I hadn't grown up middle class? It's interesting because I had my own biases, and I had this image of what an inheritor was, and I think it was, Paris Hilton was my image. And for my book, I ended up interviewing 11 women, and because I wanted to include different voices and different experiences within the book, so I included different voices, and I interviewed a couple of inheritors. And inheriting money is really a tricky situation. I mean, you have, especially if your family has a name, it's very hard to kind of carve out your own identity separate from your family. I think it can be quite a burden. And I think I think the question kind of imagine, is sort of thinking that if you have a lot of wealth, you're kind of so distant from reality. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the fact that we see these stereotypes and we see kind of this visible wealth that's out there, but there's so much more that's, hidden in plain sight. And I think there's a lot of people with wealth right now are wanting to make change in society. And I'm not living in a society that I like, and when one person's in pain, we are all in pain because we're all interconnected. And so I'd like to see us, and I think, again, it's like it's complex at the policy level and structural level that needs to change, but let's start change just within our families, with our friends, and talk more openly so that we can learn, we can collaborate, we can kind of identify, issues, because right now it's so much is hidden. And then there is a question for you, Cameron, about someone, and I think maybe you answered this, maybe it's a trusted family member or a friend. What would you recommend if you're older and you don't have children or a partner?
I think it is so important to identify someone you trust. Maybe it is a friend, a close friend. Maybe it is a cousin, a niece, a nephew. You need to identify at least one person, maybe a couple of people who will these will be your point people. These will be the people who will be able to step in and help with financial matters, not necessarily provide financial support, but will help manage your finances if something ever happens to you. Someone you can name as an executor for your will who will settle your estate when you die, or a trustee if you happen to have a trust. You need to have a trusted person, someone you can count on. And this is especially important for women because women, as we know, we live longer, and because we do live longer, what we're much more likely to need long-term care. And long-term care takes planning. Long-term care can be incredibly expensive if you are receiving that care, whether it's in home from a paid professional, whether it's in an assisted living facility, a memory care facility, or a nursing home. And so you need to have someone who's going to be able to manage your finances for you if you end up needing long-term care. So I do encourage you to find someone you can name as your power of attorney, someone you can name as your healthcare proxy, someone you can name as your executor for your will, or your trustee for your trust. And have conversations with that person, provide them with details about their finances so that if something happens to you, they are armed with the information they need to step in and take over.
Thank you. Thanks, Cameron, so much for being in conversation with me. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today to listen to this conversation. A big thank you to Book Passage. And I'll turn it over to Cheryl. And thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, ladies. Cameron, Jennifer, this was such an exciting, informative, raw, personal discussion tonight, and we really appreciate it as your audience. Okay, again, the book by Jennifer, We Need to Talk, a memoir about wealth. You heard Jennifer talk about the story with her brother. This book is an essential book to have in any family library. Anybody in any family, there's always somebody with more, and that can cause problems. Jennifer's book, it's a guidebook to help you with those issues and other issues related to some people having more, some people having less. Wealth managers out there who are listening tonight, we've sold many, many, many copies to local wealth management organizations. So this is an essential book for you and your staff. Please get in touch with us at Book Passage. These books are selling quickly. We're happy to help you. We're looking forward to getting this book into the hands of many people out there because it's an essential book and it'll make your life better. And of course, Cameron's book, Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk. I don't know how you can live without this book because everybody deals with aging parents. This is a wonderful guidebook to help you with all those issues. You have to have it. And if you don't need it yet, I'm sure there are other people you know who could really benefit from this book. Okay, again, both books for sale at Book Passage. You don't have to, stores are open. Come in and browse if you want to. Order online. Call us up. We're happy to help you. One more thing, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's free and it helps us out a lot. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. We've presented over 100 authors bringing their stories and messages into your homes virtually. We hope to be in person one day soon. And thank you to all our old customers and to our new people joining us today. Please keep in touch with us with our website. We'll see you again, either in our stores or online. Have a great evening, and thank you again.